Hi, everyone. This is Gary Price, founder and editor of Library Journal's infoDOCKET, here with another open access interview. Today, we're speaking to MacKenzie Smith, a name and a person who is likely familiar to many of you. MacKenzie Smith has been the University Librarian at UC Davis, University of California, Davis, since June 2012, and is responsible for all aspects of the library's operations. MacKenzie, thanks for chatting with me today.
Thank you for having me, Gary. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. With so much background, especially in the open access movement, I'd like to learn a little bit about when and why your interest in the open access movement began. Why open access?
Right. So my involvement in the open access movement, as you call it, really dates back to when I joined MIT in 2002. Because I, as you mentioned, was heavily involved in launching the DSpace project with Hewlett-Packard Labs to develop what is now sort of referred to as an institutional repository. And the genesis of that project was actually not open access, it was digital preservation and archiving at a time when more and more researchers were beginning to produce digital scholarship and they didn't really have anywhere to archive it. So we created the DSpace project, but MIT was also very intrigued by the potential of open access and very aware of how broken the traditional scholarly communication system has become. So right about the time DSpace was coming to be, there were some very seminal papers published about institutional repositories and the promise that they had for open access. So we became very involved in that movement and early advocates for it among academics at MIT and other libraries who were beginning to adopt the DSpace platform. So that's really how I got involved in it. And from the very beginning, it's just seemed to me that in the digital age, the concept of open access just has this inevitability about it because it makes so much more sense than the current system in a digital age when the cost of replication is zero. And the speed of our ability to transmit knowledge is close to nothing. So it just seems like from the minute I heard about it, I said, you know, this is how it's going to end up. The only question is how long it takes and what path it takes.
Are you pleased at where the open access, as we'll call it, movement is at this point?
With anything this big, things happen very, very slowly, and then they happen really, really fast. Mm-hmm. Right? So a lot of people thought open access was going to take a few years to catch on back in the early 2000s, and of course, that's not the way it's playing out. But I do see an acceleration occurring now, 10 years on, 10 or 15 years. Almost every academic I speak to now knows what open access is and has an opinion on it. And more of them have experimented with it. So it's becoming kind of just a normal part of the discourse we have about scholarly communication. And that doesn't mean we've solved every problem and it's a done deal, but the scratching of heads is pretty much over at this point. And we have some very successful publishers in the open access world, you know, so it's beginning to seem very real to a lot of people, I think.
Let's talk a little bit more practical stuff. As the director of a large academic library, can you speak about the awareness, something you just started with a moment ago, the awareness of students and faculty about OA, not only the concepts, but of the resources available? And are there any projects at UC Davis you're working on right now that might be of interest to our viewers?
Yes, that is an excellent question. While awareness may be high, there is still quite a lot of confusion about the different forms of open access and what those cost and the resources available to authors to take advantage of open access publishing outlets. So for example, there are quite a few people who still hear open access and think predatory publishers. Mm-hmm. You know, and you have to sort of remind them that there are very good publishers in the space, like the Public Library of Science, and that more and more traditional publishers are providing open access options to people. so that in fact it doesn't look like you're going to have to choose between your favorite publisher and some new, fly-by-night publisher you never heard of, right? You can choose the journal that you want to publish in and still be part of the open access movement. So that is still an educational process that's going to take a while, I think. And then the resource issue is another one where, of course, most authors just assume that if it is a pay-to-publish model, such as the Gold open access model, then they're going to have to pay for that themselves. And my library, like many, has an open access fund that people can apply to for subsidies to the fees. We also provide a lot of education. We talk to authors about other funds that are available on campus to subsidize publishing costs, and so that's gradually getting to be less of an issue. And I also wanted to point out that a lot of authors I talk to have always had to pay to publish. There are page fees, and in the sciences it's quite common for an author to have to pay hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to publish an article today under the current system. So for those authors, it's not at all strange to think of just paying a fee and having an open access for everyone.
What would you say, or what do you say, or what have you said to people who say, well, we can do all of this for free. Why are we charging anybody for anything? Yeah. What does that mean today?
Right. And you and I both know that there is no such thing as a free lunch.
Right.
Somebody is paying. And it has always been the case that some journals were subsidized by foundations or philanthropists, and that caused the cost to be lower. There are other journals that just keep their costs very low through, not paying their editorial staff and so on, or using very minimalistic infrastructure. And all of that has always existed and will continue to exist. But a typical journal or a monograph publisher has to have some revenue, right? But what has gotten out of whack is the degree of profit that some publishers are able to get, and the lack of sort of checks and balances in the system to prevent that from getting out of control. So the current system is just unsustainable, but that doesn't mean that the new system will have no cost involved, right? It just has to get back to a reasonable cost and a reasonable profit.
You said last year, quote, "Our mission as libraries is to ensure access to research, and open access is a promising means to that end." Well, access means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But one way I often look at access is that it's one thing to have everything in a database or on a bookshelf, so to speak, but what about the discovery aspects involving open access and awareness? So we've talked about awareness. What about discovery? Do we need to do better with making these resources discoverable? And to a certain degree, do people, the traditional student, let's say, do they really even, they should, but do they even really care about where it's coming from? Because we've often heard, when we've seen research, well, people take what they can get. It's the whole satisficing idea. They take what they can get, and that's good enough. Because one of the things I encounter when doing research is that, well, there's so many different silos, if you like, of open access material. And I'm not just speaking about open access print material. I'm talking about, not only text, but multimedia and increasingly data sets. So there's so many different places to go to get all of this, and most people are interested in getting something and that being good enough. So what can we do more, what can we do better or more of to increase discovery of these materials?
Wow. There are a lot of questions packed into what you just said.
Pick one or two.
Okay. Let me kind of separate a couple of issues there. One is about discovery and other things that are changing and how open access affects that. And then second is the whole information literacy, selection, quality, judgment, those kinds of issues. So on the former, one of the things that's really great about open access, and one of the reasons I think it is kind of inevitable, is that it makes discovery so much easier. Right? Everything that is openly accessible can easily be indexed by Google and other search engines, and we see automatically more readership and more citation of open access articles, almost certainly because of that easier accessibility. And the other thing is, in a digital age, you know, eyeballs aren't the only ways that people consume journal articles, right? Increasingly, I have scholars asking for text mining or other kinds of excuse me, data mining access to the literature. And that is particularly difficult to do in the traditional model. Whereas with open access and the right kinds of licensing regimes, you can easily aggregate content to do new cool kinds of science with it or other kinds of scholarship. So it just adds so much more value to the literature if you can do these new things with it without the friction of having to, you know, make new licensing terms with a publisher and so on. So big win on the access and reuse front from open access. On the flip side, as you say, it's becoming trivially easy to find things on the internet, so students don't necessarily say, is this the best article I can find? You know, it's the first 20 hits in Google that they'll look at. So libraries have a huge obligation to step up and help students and even faculty in some cases understand which discovery sources they can trust, how to determine whether a publisher is quality or not in a changing world. Just all of this added nuance that open access and the internet have brought to scholarship. And so I think we're really turning our attention away from, say, more on the cataloging and discovery side to more on the information literacy and evaluation of resources.
Well, as I said in our first interview with Peter Suber a few weeks ago, I really personally believe that a lot of this information literacy, digital literacy, if you like, and awareness of open access, awareness of all this material really needs to start before students reach the UC Davis Library, meaning probably at the junior high or high school level. And I hope that's something that, as I said to Peter, that the entire community can get behind and get academic libraries, research libraries working more and more with the K-12 school library community. I'm going to ask you a question that I encounter, I think about all the time. As we've talked about, more and more material is becoming available wherever it may be. I am often finding, in doing the work I do for infoDOCKET, you know, full text articles, often preprints, available completely for free on the internet, on the open web, let's call it. So while the full version is important, at least at this point, for all different, a number of reasons, don't you think that a lot of people, just access to the preprint is more than awesome, let alone it's available for free? How do we make this distinction between taking an article off the open web that will appear in a well-established journal, whether it be open access or not, versus the resources and time of getting the final for publication version available?
This is a really interesting question, and my own thinking about this has evolved quite a bit recently. Partly because at the University of California, we have a relatively new open access policy for faculty, green policy. So faculty are depositing preprint versions of their articles in eScholarship now, and a very, very common problem is that they don't have that version, that final manuscript version. So it's difficult for them to comply with the policy today. And so now we're saying, well, just hang on to that version as you publish so you can put that in the eScholarship repository. And a common theme that I'm hearing is quite a few authors saying, well, no, it's not the same. There were significant changes made after that point, before the version that went up on the publisher's site. And I'm not comfortable with the last manuscript version being the one that I submit, so I have to redo a lot of the changes that were made later to the article, and that takes quite a lot of time. So what I'm learning is that in some disciplines and some publishers, there's a lot that happens between the accepted manuscript and the publication point. Not always on the publisher's side, right? So it's But it's not the case that you can assume that the final author manuscript is exactly equivalent to what was published in the end. Okay.
So, go ahead.
Well, no, that's the main point, is that I had believed before that the final manuscript version was perfectly acceptable, and I think in some disciplines it is.
So
but
is this another role? You talked a moment ago about digital literacy and making our users aware of what's going on. So how do we tell, whether it be a student or another faculty member doing research, well, I can give you this early version, this pre-pub version of this article, but it might not be exactly the same when the final version comes out 7 months later.
Yeah, that's tough, because explaining to a reader what the differences are, I couldn't do it. Right. Only the author knows how significant the changes were after that version. So it's up to the author really to decide, and if, you know, so it's a lot more nuanced than I imagined. Right. Made me believe that really we just need to get to a point where the final version can be posted.
I'd like to also spend some time, as we close out here, talking about the research project, Pay It Forward, where you're the lead investigator on. And as opposed to, I was wondering if you could, as opposed to just reading an intro, I was hoping that we could spend a few minutes with the lead investigator telling us about the project, about its funding, where the idea came from, and your partners.
Sure. And your timing is good, because that project is coming to an end, so we will very soon have the final results to share.
Okay.
But let me just explain what the project is. So the genesis of that project was a conversation that I had when I arrived here with my colleagues at the California Digital Library, and Ivy Anderson in particular, about whether the so-called gold model of author payments or article processing charges would be sustainable for very large research universities in North America, given that our funding models in this country for universities are quite different than Europe and other parts of the world, where gold has been, you know, getting a lot more attention. And we observed two things. One is that the green and gold models for open access are a bit on a collision course. We can't really afford to do both at the same time on a global scale. So we really do need to understand the pros and cons of each of these. And secondly, Ivy had done some back-of-the-envelope calculations about what it was going to cost the University of California if we did switch to the gold model. And it was a horrifying number, much higher than what we pay now in the aggregate for journal subscriptions. So I decided that we really needed to get to the bottom of this question. Right? Would it be sustainable for the University of California or any other major research university to switch to the gold model if we're paying the kinds of, I'll call them APCs, article processing charges, that we're seeing today? So we wrote a grant proposal that was funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, thank you, and spent the last year researching that question. So I'll just describe the partnership very quickly, because it's quite a big and complex team. But on the modeling side, it's myself and Lane Farley and Ivy Anderson at California Digital Library, and a data analyst there, Matt Wilmot. Greg Tannenbaum has been helping us from Scholar Next, and that's sort of the core local team. But then we have Bo Christer Bjork and David Solomon, who are both, you know, world experts on open access and different financial models for that. Mark McCabe is a microeconomist we are working with, who's also quite well known in this space. So we've really worked hard to find people who understand the business and economic side of it. On the data side, we're partnering with Elsevier for Scopus data and Thomson Reuters for Web of Science, because we needed a lot of bibliometric data and bibliographic data to kind of see who's publishing what. And then we're working with the libraries of the UC system, but also Ohio State University, University of British Columbia, and Harvard as other major research libraries that we wanted to compare our results with. And we've looked at 5 years worth of library subscription data, so how much are libraries paying into the system today. And then we've looked exhaustively at article processing charges and how those are settling out to see what the average cost of those would be. We're doing that across disciplines and trying to see if we can figure out whether you could take research library journal budgets and just make them available to pay APCs, and would that be sufficient, right? And so one of the first things we've done is calculate the break-even point. So what could a university afford to pay as an average article processing charge if it was just the library budget available? And then what are alternative financial models for funding APCs if the answer to that is it's not enough?
Right.
Okay? And it's been fascinating, right? And one of the interesting things is that, as we talked about earlier, most authors just assume that if there is an APC, they're going to have to pay for that themselves. So they're already developing the habit of using their grant funds to pay those fees, or applying to their department to pay those fees. So it's becoming clear that we're going to need a little bit more sophisticated system of not just the library paying or the author paying out of their pocket, but some combination of funding sources, and that's what we're working on right now, is what would that look like. So the answer is kind of a mixed bag. You know, it's obviously, if you're at an institution that publishes a lot, you're going to bear a high percentage of the cost of the publishing system going forward. Is that unsustainable? Not necessarily. You're also probably getting a lot more grant funding than a smaller institution that doesn't do research. So the picture is complex, but not entirely bad.
You talked a moment ago about other forms of open access financing.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk just a little bit about a few of those, of what you'll be talking about in the report, in the final report?
Well, there really are just two models for open access. One is where you use the traditional publishing system but make a version of your article available, the green model that we already talked about. So we'll set those costs aside, because that's not what we're talking about now. In the gold model, the author pays a fee somehow, and that can be anywhere from nothing for subsidized gold journals to, in some cases, $5,000 to $6,000 an article in named journals. So there's a wide spectrum of costs there, and as I said, authors can find the money to pay those fees from a variety of sources that range from the library's open access fund to their grant to their startup funds. You know, many universities have a publication fund that authors can apply to for page charges. So there are lots of sources of funding available to them now, and what we're trying to do is figure out which combinations of those would create the right incentive structure to keep the publishing system sane in the future.
I would imagine that there's probably also more need for marketing and promotion of some of these funding sources inside of a university, that faculty members who publish might not even be aware of them.
That's true, yeah.
Well, I appreciate your time, MacKenzie. Thank you for taking a few minutes to chat with us, and I hope to do it again soon.
Thank you, Gary. It was a pleasure.